Thank you very much, Bright, for that introduction. I would also like to thank the Rachel Carson Center for allowing me to come on this fellowship. The last 2 years for me have been very busy, as probably for everyone, and being a Landhaus Fellow has given me the time and space to think more creatively, and I'm very grateful for that. I've learned a lot from all the conversations with people at the RCC, and particularly from conversations with my fellow Landhaus inhabitants. I've learned how to be a better academic, but also, I think that's also even more important, a better human being. So today I'll be giving you a talk about the Central African Copperbelt, which is a heavily mineralized mining region. I'd like to start with an anecdote. Margaret Waya, who is a long-term resident of the Zambian mining hub of Mufulira, recalled that during her lifetime, mining had always been accompanied by pollution. She claimed that in the 1960s and the 1970s, we did not have a problem with it really. The situation, however, changed in the 1990s when a privatized multinational took over from the previously state-owned conglomerate, which, according to Margaret Waya, brought a number of problems, big problems. Not only did blasting damage her house, but her son developed asthma due to the sulfur dioxide emissions from the mine, which required frequent and, importantly, costly medical attention. This prompted Waya to start mobilizing through a local NGO called Green and Justice, and I quote from her testimonial: "I know the extent of this issue, and I can hear and smell it, and I sense the pain it causes. I see how much destruction it has brought to my life and environment." So, throughout more than a century, mining has severely scarred the environment of the Central African Copperbelt. Tall smokestacks have emitted suffocating air pollution, acid spills in the river have killed fish, and giant waste dumps have become markers of urbanity, even as they are also highly toxic. Still, surprisingly enough, until the 1990s, pollution remained relatively below the radar. Copperbelt residents rarely took to the streets or mobilized in social movements as a reaction to pollution. In the 1990s, this changed quite suddenly as environmental NGOs came up, such as Green and Justice, which I just mentioned. Mining companies drew up environmental impact assessments to look at the pollution they were causing. Newspapers started covering issues of pollution, and even court cases were brought against the mining companies. And in my presentation today, I want to ask why this change? Why did, in the 1990s, suddenly this discourse about pollution start changing? So that will be the central question guiding us through the presentation. In the scholarship, the worldwide rise of environmental movements has been subject of quite a lot of works and good works. The more economically focused scholars have come up with two kind of theories. One stating that environmentalism would be the consequence of post-material affluence. If people would have their livelihoods secured, they would be able to afford to care about the environment. A quite different theory argued that there was something called the environmentalism of the poor. And this theory argues that people who depend on natural resources for their livelihoods and their subsistence will be more likely to protest if these natural resources are endangered by activities such as mining. More political scholars have argued that environmental regulations have globalized with time. So the United Nations Environment Programme was established in Nairobi, headquartered there in the 70s. And social movements such as Friends of the Earth spread across the world. Yet others have referred to very local social movements. So they have looked for the root causes of environmentalism in the trade union movement, in particular details of gendered organization or other factors. In my presentation today, I will argue that none of these factors fully explains the environmentalism on the Copperbelt. And yeah, this will surprise you very much as a historian, that we need to look at local factors to understand the relationship between mining communities, the mines, and the rise of environmentalism. So I'll ask when, why, and how mining communities addressed environmental concerns by focusing on three issues. First, corporatism, then I'll explain something about paternalism, and finally, the rise of environmentalism in the 1990s. So just to give you a bit of background, since not all of you might be familiar with the Central African Copperbelt, it's a heavily mineralized region. Apart from copper, there are cobalt reserves, zinc, uranium, gold, diamonds. It's a very rich, in terms of minerals, area. Mining, large-scale industrial mining, started there in 1907 on the Congolese side in Lubumbashi, and on the Zambian side in Luanshya in 1927. And this was in the colonial period when Congo was ruled by the Belgians and Zambia, Northern Rhodesia at the time, by the British. Mining was really the central pillar of the colonial state, and this continued into the post-independence period. Both Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo in the late 1960s nationalized their mines. So the states owned the mines, and the mine revenues were central to the building of the nationalist state. This went well for a while until in the 1970s, a severe economic crisis hit the region. After the two global oil crises, copper prices collapsed, and in the 80s and 90s, prices were very low and production dropped, and the Copperbelt was in a severe crisis. And both Zambia and Congo had to ask for loans from the World Bank and the IMF, and they imposed structural adjustment programs which forced the privatization of the formerly state-owned mining companies onto both countries. So this is just a kind of rough background. My work is part of a broader trend of cross-border scholarship. So treating the Central African Copperbelt as a single interconnected region. Obviously, there are many differences between the Zambian and the Congolese trajectories, but I will argue that there are also many parallels, and this history of economic boom and bust, nationalization of the mining industry, and subsequent privatization are shared by both Zambia and Congo. So in my presentation today, I'll draw heavily on oral history interviews that I conducted mainly in 2018 in Congo in the town of Likasi and in Zambia in the town of Mufulira. I've also conducted a lot of archival research, but I wanted to give you an insight into how people explain environmentalism themselves. So to start, I wanted to give you an insight into how mining companies constructed this idea of corporatism. And what I understand as corporatism is an attitude which is heavily focused on production, making profits, and coming up with techno fixes that render pollution invisible. So in the archival documents, I've read a lot of reports by the mining companies, by the colonial and post-colonial states, and pollution is actually hardly ever mentioned. And I just wanted to give you an insight from one of these quotes, a document by the Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines in the 1980s. This was the state-owned mining company in Zambia. So just to quote, "In combating both air and water pollution, the mining industry has to keep in mind its unique role in the national economy. The industry has a duty to restrict its expenditure on the non-productive, usually costly means of controlling pollutants, so that the nation is not needlessly deprived of essential revenue." So what this quote suggests is that combating pollution is costly for the mining company, and therefore they should be strategic about how and where they reduce pollution, because if you reduce it too much, production will be endangered and the company can't make profit anymore. So to give you some insights into how this discourse and narrative of productivism was constructed, I would like to give you some quotes about medicine and health. So copper mining posed a risk for mine workers, but also for people living around the mine through dust, through polluted water runoff, all these kinds of things. And doctors showed great awareness that mining could lead to all kinds of diseases, silicosis, pneumoconiosis, these are all respiratory diseases, various sorts of cancer and skin diseases due to the toxic elements of copper mining. So again, from the archives, a 1974 doctor who worked for Gécamine, and this was the state-owned mining company in Congo, acknowledged that pollution could be a cause of occupational diseases. But he said, to secure production, industries are obliged to accept these permanent risks to the health of their workers. And in oral history interviews as well, many people said that doctors were aware of the link and the connection between mining and occupational diseases. Diamond Kachusha, who worked on the Zambian mines for a long period of time, attested that there were certain cases whereby the doctors were reluctant to reveal the medical conditions of employees. Doctors were part of management, so they had to protect the company, because otherwise they would have to compensate each employee. So if a worker was diagnosed with pneumoconiosis, it was favorable for the company to not make the direct link to mining, because otherwise they would have to continue compensating this employee for his disease, and that would cost the company money. Ilunga Wakumanza, who was a trade unionist in Likasi, argued that a sick worker can't produce, so the company loses profit. That's why it's in the interest of the mines to prevent pollution, diseases, and accidents, because a healthy worker can produce more. So disease prevention and accident prevention ultimately will be profitable for the mining company. Cyprien Ramazani, who worked in the mines in Likasi for a long time, argued that everybody worried about pollution. But if we complain, the response would be the country needs to function, the people need to live, the state needs money. We would complain to doctors, but if we complain too much, they would tell us, if you don't want to work here, pack your bags, there are others who will take your place. So there was not just a link between mining pollution and diseases that was evident to doctors, but also in the trade union movement. Both Zambia and Congo had a very strong trade union movement. Not only did they play a role in obtaining independence, but also in the 1990s in the transition from a one-party state to multi-party democracy. And it's therefore relatively remarkable that the trade unions rarely addressed issues of pollution in terms of complaints. And I think this can be traced back to this issue of a very strong mining company and this attitude of corporatism, a focus on profit and production. So workers who had been in the trade union themselves told me that a trade unionist is a worker before all else. In this sense, he has no power whatsoever over his boss. So the mining company was quite powerful, and even trade unionists were dependent on the mine company, which made it difficult to voice concerns about pollution. So Ilunga Wakumanza, again, who was a prominent trade unionist in Likasi, argued that the trade unionists would sometimes gather the workers together just to appease them if they had complaints about pollution, to make them believe that they would transmit their complaints to management. Our employers regularly received complaints about pollution, but they made no significant effort to ameliorate the situation. Mine management was much more concerned and attentive to salary demands, because salary demands would lead to work stoppages, and that would mean no production for a day. Whereas pollution complaints weren't accompanied by work stoppages and therefore were easier for mine management to dismiss. So from the oral history interviews, it becomes very evident that people were acutely aware of issues of pollution. One particular form of pollution that was discussed very much was sulfur dioxide pollution. So the fumes from the mines that suffocate people. And on the Zambian Copperbelt, it gained the local name of Senta. Nathan Mwamba, who was also a trade unionist, argued that we used to complain about it, saying that the Senta was too much. We just used to be told by mine management that they've heard our complaints and they would see what they could do about it. But our complaints always just ended there. We used to complain to the trade union about Senta, but they never bothered much about it. So this can be traced back to this attitude of strong mining companies who foreground production and profit. And even city council, municipal council employees had little power over the activities of the mines, since the highest ranks of government were benefiting from mining. So where could you take your complaints? So one issue that played a large role here is policies of paternalism. And this paternalism started on the Congolese Copperbelt in the 1920s and was instituted more and more on the Zambian Copperbelt as well after the Second World War. And what did paternalism mean? Paternalism meant that workers on the mines were not just employed by the mines. They didn't just receive a salary, they were also housed by the mines. They got electricity and water as part of their salary. Hospitals were run by the mines, schools were run by the mines, even recreation. So theater plays were set up by the mines, football clubs were organized by the mines. And this policy of paternalism was not just a colonial relic, it actually reached its apex in the 1970s. When the state-owned companies even expanded these policies of paternalism. And you see here pictures of the very standardized mine housing. This would be for a kind of middle rank mine employee, these types of houses. Marisika Nguni, who was the wife of a mine worker and who traded tomatoes herself, argued that the mine was her source of livelihood. So when someone was working for the mine, they wouldn't complain much. So even people who didn't directly work for the mine were dependent on the mine for their income. A tomato trader, if all the salaries from the mine wouldn't come in, equally the tomato trader wouldn't have clientele. And this kind of paternalism was couched in a rhetoric of care. So people argued still today on the Copperbelt that the mining company took care of them. So what did this care in their eyes mean? One example given was that people could have high-risk jobs that exposed them to certain diseases, but they were well cared for. They were well paid, well equipped for their jobs, with gumboots and hard hats, and they would receive regular checkups by a doctor, by a company doctor. So this narrative of care, to an extent, subsumed complaints about pollution and risk, job risks. So for example, when a worker reached retirement age, mine management would give them a letter stating that if they got sick, they could go back to the mine hospital at no cost. People considered this a good gesture because the mine was again taking care of them. So this is an example of the welfare center in Likasi. You see the disused swimming pool. In the corner there you had the karate club, and the tall building there is where the theater plays would be staged by the mining club. So these narratives of care worked very much to underscore a discourse of order and cleanliness, and subsequently, after the mines were privatized, a discourse of dirt and dilapidation. So as long as the paternalistic state-owned mining companies took care of workers, there was order. But once the privatized mining companies in the 1990s didn't pay for the karate club anymore, there was disorder and dirt. And I'll illustrate that through these two quotes. So in Mufulira, Levi Chushi argued that he made an argument about the mine-owned neighborhoods. So Cantanci was a mine-owned neighborhood, and Cibolia was a municipal neighborhood where non-mine workers lived and where people had to take care of their own housing. So previously, Cantanci, the mine-owned neighborhood, had been well kept. Company agents would maintain our houses and make sure the roads were passable. Today, after privatization, Cantanci has become just like Cibolia. Yes, you can make an effort to maintain your house yourself, but otherwise dirt is everywhere and people just throw rubbish anyhow. This has caused diseases. People are getting ill. It never used to be like this. And the argument I want to make is that it wasn't necessarily the case that pollution or dirt increased dramatically after the 1990s. It was just that this narrative and discourse of care disappeared after the privatized mining companies no longer had such an expansive social welfare net. So in Likasi you find similar narratives. Jacques Kibombo, who was the chef de cité of a mining neighborhood, argued that everything changed in 1990. Nobody cared for the roads or public lighting anymore. When Jekamin experienced hardship, so did Likasi. Before, you even had to wait for a company agent to trim your hedge, but now there are no more agents in charge of cleaning. As long as Jekamin doesn't wake up, we will endure this situation. So, whereas prior to the 1990s, it had been rare to voice concerns about pollution openly, this changed quite radically towards the 2000s and afterwards. Various NGOs came up that addressed environmental concerns. You had Green and Justice, Citizens for a Better Environment. The mines drew up elaborate environmental impact assessments, which made plans for how to reconstruct and rehabilitate post-mining landscapes. And newspapers covered issues of pollution regularly. In 2019, for example, some residents of Chingola sued Vedanta, which was a multinational mining company, in a UK court. And the judge ruled that indeed the mining company had a duty of care to not pollute the water sources of these farmers. So I'd like to ask, why did this narrative about pollution change so suddenly in the 1990s if oral histories show us so clearly that even before the 1990s people were aware of pollution and could make the link between occupational disease and pollution? And I argue that it's because of the privatization of the mining companies and the falling away of the paternalistic policies. So I have just a couple of quotes that refer very much to these new mining companies, the new multinationals that came in after the 1990s. Sorry. Considering these new mining companies, interviewees told me that the problem with them and their pollution is their overt focus on production, wanting to maximize production at all costs. Mining companies are too focused on production and neglect security measures that affect producers. But if we look at this quote, and if we put it alongside the ZCCM quote from the 1980s, which says that pollution control is costly for the mining company, there's not that much of a difference in terms of focusing on production. But interviewees had a very strong narrative that the new mining companies were focused on production, whereas the old mining companies cared for them. Whereas actually this wasn't so new. Another trope that came up very much was that the mining companies have multiplied in numbers. It's hard to control so many different companies. So nowadays you'll have mining companies from Australia, Canada, all over the world, India, whereas previously you had one big mining conglomerate and that would have been easier to control. So people use quite strong language when they were speaking about pollution nowadays. They said, we have been sacrificed. Others said that they had been squeezed like lemons. But still, the environmentalism that did emerge on the Copperbelt remained limited by the structural position that people had towards the mining companies. And this is the final quote I will give you about why environmentalism, even today on the Copperbelt, remains hard. And I'll end with Diamond Katyusha, one of the people we've been introduced to in the beginning. Today, trade unions remain powerless. They're also employees of the mining company. They're also afraid of being retrenched, fired. They're like messengers of employers. If they had been independent, it would have been better. The conditions are sometimes very bad because we have high unemployment. You find that if people complain too much, they scare away investors. So people don't complain because they don't want to chase away their employers. So we see from this quote that still, even today, with the privatized mining companies and all the knowledge about pollution scandals, environmentalism on the Copperbelt remains hard. So I'd just like to conclude very briefly by saying that environmentalism is a complex phenomenon and it's hard to pinpoint why it emerges. But I've made an argument that it's important to look at local and situated knowledge and the relationships between mining communities and mining companies to understand in which registers environmental concerns are expressed. Thank you very much for your attention.